Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Desert Botanical Garden. My name is Kimberly McHugh, and I am the Program Director for Conservation of Threatened Species and Habitats here at the Garden, and I am very pleased to welcome you all to this special evening event with Dr. Georgina Mace. A little earlier this afternoon, I had the privilege of taking Dr. Mace on a tour of our garden, and during that time, I shared a little bit about the history of our garden, and I want to share some of that story with you as we start our evening, because the founding of this garden is so relevant to the topic of Dr. Mace's talk tonight. The garden was founded in 1939. We celebrate our 75th anniversary earlier this year, and it's an amazing story. Back in the 30s, a group of people living here in Phoenix who loved the desert, loved desert plants, looked around and said, oh my gosh, we're losing the desert to development. In fact, one of their fears was that the city of Phoenix, the population would grow to 50,000 people. If they only knew. And so they set out to try and figure out a way how they could save the desert. And I want to say that, besides being just very forward-thinking, conservation was not a word on the tip of everybody's tongue back in the 20s and 30s. But not only that, at that same time, here in Phoenix, there was a concerted effort through the Chamber of Commerce to eradicate the desert. So, you have big entities in town saying, we want rose gardens, and we want big palm trees, and we don't want cactus, and things like that. And you had this small group of people saying, no, the desert matters, we need to care for it. And so their eventual idea about how to help save the desert was to form a botanical garden where they could showcase the desert, bring people here, and inspire them about the beauty and special nature of the desert. And that's why this garden exists. And from the beginning in 1939, our mission has been the research, conservation, education, and exhibition of desert plants. It's amazing. It makes me proud to work here. And 75 years after our founding, we're still growing our conservation efforts. And among them is a major initiative to study, restore, and promote the desert mountain preserves in Maricopa County. And we call this initiative the Central Arizona Conservation Alliance. And the alliance is formed by an ever-growing group of partners with varied types of expertise coming at this issue from different spaces, but all with the idea that these natural spaces are important and we need to work to preserve them. And ASU is one of our partners in this, and one of the newest partners from ASU is the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, who is a co-host with us of this event tonight. In fact, it is through that partnership that this evening is possible. And so I want to thank them, ASU, and the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. It's a really exciting partnership that we have going. And so with that, I would like to turn the podium over for a few additional remarks to Dr. Gary Dirks, who is the director of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability, which is the home of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. Dr. Dirks.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to join this launch event this evening. This is the result of a lot of hard work by a large group of faculty members that are committed to sustainability at Arizona State University. And in particular, a lot of hard work coming from Leah Gerber. This has been a vision of hers and a core group of our faculty members for some time, that we create a center like the Biodiversity Outcomes. And so it's a real pleasure for me to be here this evening to see the launch of that event. As you heard a moment ago, I am the director of the Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. This is a position that I've been in now for a bit more than a year. And in this year period that I've been the director, one of the key things that we've been looking at is how do we achieve the goals that we have for what we call the current version of GEOS, or I should say more precisely, that our president, Michael Crow, calls the current version of GEOS, GEOS 3.0. How do we achieve those goals, which is to demonstrate that we can have an impact on sustainability and set ourselves up to really be a very substantial player in the space of sustainability on the global stage, GEOS 4.0. A very important aspect of what came out of some of those that strategic thinking is that we need to have a select group of initiatives in various different areas that are relevant to sustainability as really the focal point for driving forward and projecting the abilities that our faculty has. I lead another initiative called Lightworks, and that has now become part of GEOS. That is about energy. We're also in the process of setting up new initiatives on the future of cities, in the water area, on something we call PlanetWorks, which recognizes that we are now living in the Anthropocene, and as human beings, we are now affecting this planet on the planetary scale. And then finally, a piece on education. CBO becomes a very critical part of this initiative suite. It's hard to imagine achieving a sustainable world without having a biodiverse world. Not simply because of the services that are provided by the enormous biodiversity of this planet, but because if you accept the definition of sustainability as being promoting the well-being of people today without compromising the well-being of people in the future, I can't imagine the well-being of people in the future not including a biodiverse planet where we have large mammals living in their native habitats, where we have forests, where we have rivers and streams that are places that people can enjoy as well as getting services. So this initiative is one of a suite, and this is a little bit different than some of them because it is actually a joint venture with our School of Life Sciences. And that's very important to us because many of our faculty members actually come from the School of Life Sciences. So it's a great experiment with a great team. We're very excited about it. This is the launch event that I think is going to get us off to a really great start. I hope that you thoroughly enjoy this evening's proceedings. And for those of you that are interested in biodiversity outcomes, stay in touch with what we're doing. We're delighted always to have the engagement of not just faculty members, but the community as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Leigh to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Kim, for your gracious welcome, and thank you, Gary, for your kind remarks. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today to celebrate the launch of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes with our esteemed colleague, Dr. Georgina Mace. And I also wanted to acknowledge the many faculty, students, staff, and community members who have contributed to this launch event this evening. So what I'd like to do is start with a few words about the center and how it evolved, and then move on to introducing Dr. Mace. So biodiversity outcomes is kind of a peculiar term. How did this come about? What do we mean by biodiversity outcomes? Well, over the last couple of years with my colleagues at ASU, in the School of Life Sciences, School of Sustainability, and other units, we began talking about what are the factors that determine success of conservation activities, and more fundamentally, why isn't conservation working? So we began to think about this question, and we came up with the idea that we really need new ways of doing conservation, and that these new solutions were likely to occur at disciplinary boundaries. And so this group of faculty came up with a collaborative vision for this new Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. And we were successful in garnering a small amount of support for initiating this center from the ground up with the idea of mobilizing our capacity across disciplines on the ASU campus to poise ourselves to address 21st century conservation challenges. And with this initial investment, we seek to achieve this by two mechanisms. First is providing a platform to bring together scholars to think about conservation challenges, biodiversity challenges from new angles and new disciplinary boundaries. And then to take that collective capacity and make it relevant to decision makers. So I'd like to just take a few moments to tell you about some of our programs that we're launching as part of this event this evening. We have set up our Conservation Fellows program. Our first two fellowships have been established with the McDowell Sonora Observatories, which we're very grateful to the support from the Conservancy. And we've also established a fellowship with the Conservation Alliance. We are looking to build these fellowships. These are some of the initial fellowships, but the rationale is to train the next generation of scholars in effective ways of achieving conservation outcomes. In the fall, we'll be launching a new graduate certificate program in environmental communication and leadership. And we have established some of our initial research focal areas, and these are particular areas of biodiversity science that we've determined we have a great capacity to contribute. And one of these is a developing partnership with the IUCN, the World Conservation Union. We will be under the leadership of Dr. Andrew Smith and Beth Polidero. We will be hosting an event, a symposium in February on this partnership. In addition, we have just learned, I think yesterday or today, that we've been successful in achieving our first external support from the National Social Economic Synthesis Center to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop criteria and approaches to help them make decisions about threatened and endangered species. We're also supporting work in the realm of collaborative governments with Dr. Michael Schoon, working with the Nature Conservancy in natural resource management problems in the state. And finally, we are supporting a project on renewable energy and Sonoran Desert biodiversity planning. This is Dr. Clark Miller and Dr. Abby York are leading this effort in collaboration with scientists from the Nature Conservancy and the Bureau of Land Management. So, as you can see, we have a lot that we're getting off the ground here, but we are very excited to hear your ideas for what these partnerships might look like and how we can bring our collective capacity at ASU to the real world of conservation on the ground and decision making. So please share your ideas. We're very interested in establishing focal areas in the area of public health and biodiversity, and also youth engagement in biodiversity. And as part of this launch, we will be issuing a second RFP, a request for proposals, so please check out our website, biodiversity.asu.edu, or send an email, biodiversity@asu.edu. Like any startup, we are looking to become self-sustaining, so we are in need of support for these partnerships, as well as to support events like this evening. So please reach out if you have ideas on that front. And last but not least, what I do want to express my sincere gratitude to my many colleagues who are in this room, faculty, students, staff, community supporters who have contributed to this launch this evening. So I'd like to turn to my attention to introducing Dr. Georgina Mace, who is a professor at the University College in London. She's the director of the Center for Biodiversity and Environment Research. Dr. Mace is a fellow of the Royal Society. She's the past president of the Society for Conservation Biology, the British Ecological Society, and she's the winner of the International Cosmos Prize. I met Dr. Mace, I think we were figuring out in 1995 when I was a graduate student, and she was kind enough to give me the time of day and kind enough to come here today as well. Among her many contributions to the field of conservation science, Professor Mace was instrumental in developing the criteria for listing species under the IUCN Red List, which is the most comprehensive inventory of the conservation status of the world's species. Last but not least, Professor Mace was honored as in an order of the British Empire, and so she is a commander, almost knighted by the British Empire. And so without further ado, I think that suffice it to say, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Mace this evening.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Leah, for the kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here, particularly for the opening of the Centre for Biodiversity Outcomes. It's also a real pleasure to be in such a beautiful location. I come from cold, dark, wet London. So this is a really a very beautiful place to suddenly find myself in the middle of November. And I very much enjoyed walking around the garden earlier on. So yes, and I come from a centre that has a rather similar name, Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research. We both have biodiversity, we both have centre. We clearly spell it wrongly, but I managed to get PowerPoint to accept your spelling, so I'm probably stuck with that forever now. So I'm going to give you a short talk. I've given it this slightly strange title, but it's been carefully thought through. So I'm going to talk about nature, and at the beginning of my talk, I'm going to more or less use nature and biodiversity conservation interchangeably. And as I get to the end of the talk, I'm going to try and disaggregate that term a bit, because I think the biodiversity word has many different meanings and nuances. So I'll get to that. I'm talking about accounting because one of the main conclusions of my talk is that we need to take much better care of nature because we rely on it. And what you do when you need to take care of something is you do some detailed accounting for it. So that's the reason for this slightly odd title, and I hope it will all become clear why I've called it this. So the starting point for my talk, which actually could have been the whole talk, but it's a very depressing talk about biodiversity loss, so I'm not going to give you that. I'm going to give you the whole thing in one slide. And essentially, we've been doing conservation of biodiversity now in a more or less concentrated and directed way for over 50 years. We've had serious conservation organizations for decades. We've had a convention at international level since 1992, and we've had serious international commitments since about 2002. And yet biodiversity continues to decline. This is a graph that comes from the latest assessment that the Convention on Biological Diversity put together. This is their Global Biodiversity Outlook 4, which was released last month. So this line here, called status, shows you roughly what's happening to biodiversity. And this goes from kind of 1950 to 2020. So the bit at the end here is a projected trend. And you can see both these curves for biodiversity are just showing a relentless decline, despite all this effort that's gone into biodiversity conservation efforts. And the line on the top is the pressures affecting biodiversity, and those are relentlessly going up. This is one about harvesting pressure. And this is one about human appropriation of net primary productivity. There are more and more people using the land for more and more other stuff, and so we're using a lot of the land, and the biodiversity is continuing to decline. Now, the benefits from biodiversity, these are slightly odd things here. It's rather difficult to measure, but they're going down, arguably faster than biodiversity itself. But the really important one is the line at the bottom. This is responses. This is resources that are being allocated by the international community to biodiversity conservation. Now, they're going up. They're actually going up rather nicely. But it's clearly not doing the job, because despite pushing this biodiversity funding line up, the status is continuing to go down, the benefits are going down, and the pressures are continuing to grow. So my starting point is that we're doing something wrong in biodiversity conservation. There's something that is not working, which despite all these efforts to turn that trend around, it's not happening. And I want to just start in a minute or two talking about what is the purpose of conservation? What is it we're trying to achieve through conservation? And then in the second half of my talk, I want to move into a slightly more general discussion about how biodiversity fits into environmental sustainability, and show you just a bit of some of the work we've been doing in the UK on that subject. So let's just start with this little history of biodiversity conservation. It's quite a curious fact that we don't really know what conservation is for. We can pretty much all agree what we're against. We're against the extinction of species and the loss of habitats and the loss of beautiful places and intricate communities. But what the desirable endpoint of conservation is not so clear. And as that desirable endpoint has changed over time, so has the way that people go about practicing conservation. Its major activities have shifted. And at the same time as that, interestingly, to us who are academic researchers in this area, the science base has shifted too. And I just want to run through this history of the framing of conservation science so you can see the starting point for where we are now in order to achieve a better biodiversity conservation. So I'm going to show each of these framings using these little word clouds, because I think they're a really nice way just to bring out a feel for different times in the history of conservation. And all I did with these was pick my favorite couple of papers from that era and put them into one of these word cloud makers, and then take out the things that say things like page number or and or something. And you get a nice picture of what's going on. So this is early conservation, perhaps from the 1960s, 1970s onwards, and I've called it Nature for Itself. And it is primarily about wild species. It has a big focus on protected areas, big focus on wilderness, areas generally. It's very much about preserving these beautiful, wild, remote habitats, usually with no people in them, real wild, intact areas untouched by people, and with a big focus on particularly charismatic species. And that was the framing of conservation really up until probably the late 1970s, 1980s. And at that point, we became much more concerned about the pressures on species and places. And I'm calling this phase Nature Despite People. And you can see here the focus is very much on habitat loss, extinction, pollution, threats, pathogens, and all these drivers of biodiversity loss and decline. And the pictures that accompany this are kind of a ravaged landscapes, deforested and overhunting and overharvesting of various kinds. And there was this period when, and this was when I was training as a conservation biologist, we focused very strongly on these threats. And then at the end of the sort of 1990s, 2000s, that changed again into what I'm calling nature for people. This is a more utilitarian view that nature is meeting people's needs. And this is primarily about ecosystem services. And very interestingly, species have almost disappeared and been replaced by ecosystems. So species do occur on here. I may have picked some slightly unfair papers here, but I forget, there is a little tiny species somewhere. But mostly it's about ecosystems, and no longer are we thinking about species. And even these new words like economic and valuation and values start to crop up in this period. And this was the period of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and thinking about ecosystem services as a support for people. Now, to some extent, we're still doing that. But I think in the last few years, we've moved into this fourth phase, which, oh, sorry, I'll show you the pictures of nature for people. So these are these human landscapes that are meeting people's needs, and the great poster child of nature for people, which are pollinators. They're there just to do it for us. They're our agents out there in the field. Yeah, so the fourth one, which I call people and nature. So the difference for this is actually the people come first. And it's very much a combination of people with nature, and the dominant framing of this is around resilience, adaptation, vulnerability. It's about this linked human natural system that we hope very much will prove to be more resilient in the face of great global changes. And this has, again, human-dominated landscapes, and it's very much more about people. So there's species and ecosystems. Ecosystems do occur in here, but it's much more about people. Species are gone, but ecological evolutionary adaptation, the processes that support wild nature are represented in this way of thinking. Now, I think this is the framing that comes with all the work on the Anthropocene and a new human-dominated world and so on. It's interesting that when you look at these four, you can see how the science underpinning them has changed, and the groups of people working in the field. So in the early days, this was really just biologists. This is very much a wildlife, conservation biology discipline. But when you get down to people and nature, we've got social scientists and economists and a much more interdisciplinary set of people. And that has some good things, but it has some difficult things as well, because I think we're tackling some very hard problems there. So this is a little summary of the whole transition. And what it shows you is that as we've moved from each of these into the next one, we haven't given up on any one of them. So that by the time we get to where we are now, all these framings are sitting there in a group together. And that is one of the things that's quite confusing for biodiversity conservationists right now, is that these multiple framings of conservation are living alongside each other, and they lead to lots of misunderstandings and lots of disputes. But I think, and I think nature for people was a very important phase to go through, and it will probably be eclipsed by this people and nature more dynamic interaction way of looking at it in due course. So over that period, we've moved from having this focus of conservation from preserving components of biodiversity, species and parks and places and wilderness areas, and actually to maintaining these processes about form and function, adaptability and resilience, what nature does for people. And actually, although it looks the way I've presented it, like there's been a big shift from this nature for itself to people and nature, I actually think if you go back and read a lot of the old nature conservation work early on, it was implicitly for people. I've presented it as if it was nature for itself, but actually it was nature for people. So I think we've just simply got more explicit about the role of people in this whole thing. Now, of course, all that's happened for a reason, and that reason is that during that period of time, this is actually from 1750 to 2000, we've seen these massive ramping up of human activity. So the top one here, that's population growth between 1750 and 2000. And this period from about 1950 onwards, what people call the Great Acceleration. So that's population. But all these other graphs are things that people do. So damming of rivers, motor vehicles, paper consumption. The most rapidly growing one is, interestingly enough, McDonald's restaurants. But my point about this is that all these things that people do are also putting pressure on the environment. It's not just the number of people. It's the number of people times the amount of things that they're doing. And this ramping up from 1950 onwards is having a huge effect on the planet and on our ability to maintain everything that people need from nature. And so we have to think about how we're going to manage this nature that underpins all of human activity. These components of resilience and adaptability and being able to live sustainable lives will rely on us being able to manage nature sustainably. And so I'm going to go on now and talk a bit about this accounting for nature side, with the idea that if something's really important to you, you shouldn't treat it as if it's valueless and just can be destroyed or used whenever you want to. You should take great care of it and look after the essential components. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of the UK government's Natural Environment White Paper, which came out in 2011, called The Natural Choice. And this was a government commitment for us to be the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than we inherited it in. It was an incredibly bold commitment. Actually, it was made by the government before our current government, but the white paper was actually put through by the current coalition government. And they've tried to live with that commitment. And one of the ways they tried to do this was by creating a natural capital committee. And this natural capital committee will put the value of nature at the heart of the government's economic thinking and advise our government about the best way of securing natural assets for the future. So we're starting to put nature and natural assets at the heart of economic thinking. This is reporting to a committee that's chaired by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so it has attention at the highest level of government. So we're starting to take nature seriously at last. And I'm a member of this committee. It has a bunch of economists and a couple of ecologists and an accountant and some people who work on legal affairs. And we've been thinking quite a lot about how to do this accounting for nature. So the basic idea here is that natural capital is one of the types of capital on which people depend for their well-being and welfare. So the normal way is to divide this into three major types of capital. Natural capital, this is all the stuff that nature provides us for free, that we don't have to go out and make. It's all out there. It's got its own processes that regenerate and reform itself. And that underpins all this human and social capital, which is what human societies do. And all the things that we measure as a productive, successful society are these ones that depend on both of those, manufactured and financial capital. You don't have either of those unless you've got the human capital, and those all depend on the natural capital. So it's a curious thing about financial reporting that we report on the outputs of this level, but we don't look at the underpinning base in nature and society. We don't even report on human capital, actually. So we've adopted this kind of idea of what natural capital is, and we've adopted a very general process where we have natural capital assets, that's nature, but we call them assets because we're talking to economists, and that nature produces a stock of stuff, and it produces services that produce good things that ultimately have benefit to people. And of course that doesn't come inevitably. You have to manage the nature, you have to manage nature to get this flow of services, And you don't really get the benefits without other capital inputs. You have to have produced and financial capital and people, knowledge, ingenuity, and so on. But then you get this set of benefits. And of course, we can create categories of natural capital and categories of benefits to people in order to look at this flow from nature to people's well-being. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here. One of them is that biodiversity actually occurs on both sides of this. Biodiversity is in here. It's part of our natural capital assets, so species, ecological communities, soils, subsoils, oceans, natural processes and functions. These are all things that are included when we talk about biodiversity. But we also have biodiversity as a benefit. Many of the things that people rely on nature for, food, fiber, recreation, aesthetics, and wildlife and conservation, all come from biodiversity as well. So biodiversity as a word is quite complicated in here. It's both the stock and the flow of benefits and also the benefits themselves. The other thing is that this process, again, is continuing to have to be managed in the environment, the green bit, and managed in society, the grey bit. And exactly how you achieve this set of benefits that people need depends on how you use this set of assets from nature. And there's many different ways to do it. We have a world in which we've been very much occupied with trying to feed a growing human population, so food and fibre has been very important. We're increasingly concerned about energy, clean water, clean air, and then obviously we've got this issue of an equable climate. So getting all those things in balance is part of doing the good management of the capital assets up here. So what the Natural Capital Committee does, has got 3 terms of reference. The first one is about when, where, and how natural assets are being used unsustainably. And we had about 6 weeks to try and answer this question, which is a rather hard question to answer. So what we did was took a very quick and simple approach to it and use a risk register. A risk register is something that businesses and charities and lots of organisations use all the time. And it's just a spreadsheet where you list the risks that you think you might face in your business or industry, as well as what the likelihood is, what the impact would be, what you're going to do about it, who owns that risk, and so on. And so we tried to do this for the natural capital assets, using that set of the assets and the benefits that I just showed you. And the basic idea here is that we assume that these natural assets, species and ecological systems and waterways and so on, have some relationship with benefits. So the more of them you have, the greater the benefit is. We don't know what the shape of that relationship is, but we assume that there's some kind of relationship between them. And that therefore there's some required level of benefit. This is what people need. This is what society needs. And over time, pressures from people push the status of the natural asset downwards. And so you can end up at time period 1, we had the amount of that was sufficient. It was above the target level or the required level. But as time goes on, it drops below. And so now the risk of dropping below this required level has been expressed. We've lost the natural asset. Now, of course, that relationship is really rather complicated. It could be a straight line that deteriorates, in which case you've fallen below the line sooner. It could be a line that's declining much less steeply, in which case it's declining, but it never goes below the required level. And this is what we used for every kind of benefit from nature and every kind of natural asset, and we tried to summarize it for the UK. And to do that, we put all the assets into 3 classes: quantity, quality, and spatial configuration. So how much of them there are, what the quality is, how well they were managed, and then where they are. For many of these, it matters crucially whether they're near people, whether they're in the right place. So this gets quite complicated, but we used this simple framing, but did it through major habitat types. It was too difficult to do with the assets themselves. but we had lots of data on major habitat types in the UK that made it possible to do. So we have these 8 major types of habitat in the UK. It's a very small country, we've only got 8 habitats, and they look like that. It's a quick tour of the UK. So this is obviously a very broad brush approach, but it did enable us to get some rather interesting results. So what we said was that the risk is the risk of falling below some target level. And we didn't make those target levels up. We simply took them from existing commitments in policy or in law within the EU or within the UK. So there are many of these. There are biodiversity conservation ones, there's a water framework directive, there's a set of nature protection areas, there are some targets for urban air pollution, there are some targets for bathing water quality. So you can find lots of these things. We didn't have to invent any of this. And we just looked at the status of each of these habitat types relative to that target level and asked whether it was above the line or below the line and whether it was declining rapidly or stable or declining slowly. And then made this kind of risk register thing where the red ones are the ones that are below the line or declining rapidly, orange are in the middle, and green are in good shape. So this is the result of the risk register. Here's all these habitat types across the top: mountains, farmland, grassland, woodlands, freshwaters, urban, coasts and marine. And here are the benefits: food, fibre, energy, clean water, clean air, recreation, aesthetics, hazards, wildlife conservation and climate. So anywhere where there's a red box, we're either below the target level or it's declining very rapidly. Anywhere where there's a green box, it's above the level, it's all okay, or it's declining so slowly it's not going to hit it. And the yellow and orange ones are in the middle. So it's quite interesting because you can see the habitat types that are particularly problematic. Urban is one, and freshwater is one. There's lots of orange and red in both of those. So you can look downwards. And also when you look downwards, you can see that very often it's not the quantity, it's not this QUN column that's the problem, it's the quality, it's how they're maintained. That's a very good news. If you do the management better, you can get better levels of benefit. Then you can look at the rows. So the worst row here is wildlife conservation. There's lots of red and yellow. In many areas, we're just not meeting our commitments to wildlife conservation. Curiously, we're meeting our commitments to aesthetics. I think it's easier to do scenery and so on than it is wildlife conservation. We have lots of problems with hazard protection, so we're not managing our habitats very well for that. And we have some very serious issues to do with maintaining equable climate, particularly mountain moors and heaths. That's a water and carbon regulation problem in those areas. So the risk register gives us a really interesting perspective on priorities for investing in natural capital. And of course, as you invest in any one of these, let's say we do some restoration of moorland for water quality and for climate regulation, that will then have benefits on wildlife. So you can start using this as a way to think about benefits more generally across many different assets. So the second of our terms of reference is about prioritizing action to protect and improve natural capital. We have one about research priorities, which I won't talk about, but this one's quite interesting as well. So this one is about this spatial location of restoration of natural areas. So this looks at this example where the government has committed to plant an extra 250,000 hectares of woodland. And we look at what's the best place to put that new woodland in, just taking all the UK landscape. And if you only look at the best place to put it for market price values for timber, you end up putting lots of it in fairly remote areas of Wales and Northern England and Scotland, where it's not competing with agricultural land. But if instead of just looking at the market values for timber, you look at all the other benefits that people get from woodlands, So we now put in the values for recreation, for greenhouse gas emissions, and for some urban green space values. Then you see a very different set of locations where you should put that woodland. You put it round the big urban developments around London, Manchester, Liverpool in the northwest, these big urban developments in South Wales. But the really interesting thing is that commitment to plant that woodland, if you're only looking at timber values, it actually ends up costing the government £66 million a year. But if you put all these other benefits in, it delivers a social value of about $550 million a year. So that's from particularly these recreational benefits, which is seriously underrepresented by something like this. So that's another example of just thinking about nature more generally, meeting our commitments as well as meeting the needs that people have where they live and in all parts of their lives. So I guess I'm trying to emphasize that whatever you think biodiversity is, whether it's wilderness areas or different kinds of species diversity or even networks, it underpins many of the things that people rely on and will rely on increasingly in the future as we live in a more and more crowded world. And we need to think about ways of accounting for it and taking it seriously in major sorts of planning activities. And I really like this quote from Theodore Roosevelt. This is on the wall of the Natural History Museum in New York. And I think it summarizes everything I've just set up really nicely. Particularly this bit here: the nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. So with that, welcome to the Centre for Biodiversity Outcomes, and I hope that's given you some things to think about, and thank you very much for listening to me. Yeah, so is there any opposition to what we're doing? So actually, there's a surprisingly vocal opposition to valuing nature. Just the whole process of apparently putting a price on nature. Some people really object to it because their argument is nature is important above and beyond any value it has for people. And I actually really understand that criticism. I think some of it comes from a misconception that by valuing something means you're going to sell it. And so that you're kind of equating valuing something with pricing something. And we see valuing as just making the statement that it's really important and therefore needs to be looked after, not valuing it so you can sell it. But the more serious criticism is that we may get these values wrong, and that's very easy to do. And if your decisions end up with values that are wrong, or values that just happen to be appropriate today, but don't take something into account that could be becoming important in the future, then you could be doing serious damage. So I think the answer to that is that valuing is better than not valuing. If something doesn't have a value, it's treated as valueless, which isn't true. So I think it's better to do it, but to try and be very conservative and very embracing, not dwell on the monetary value so much as the importance for people's well-being. Yeah, okay, so it's a very good question that we could easily improve the status within the UK just by exporting all our overconsumption and ecological footprint. So of course, what you should do is have an equivalent scorecard for what you're doing outside the UK. I think it is slightly different to the kind of environmental profit and loss accounting that corporations do, where they're just tracing through commodity chains, because we are actually looking at assets in the UK. We're looking at the UK's moorlands and grasslands and farmlands and air quality. So these are contained. I agree that we could keep them better by behaving badly overseas, but you can't do that for some things. You can't do it for, we can't do it for our wildlife, for example. We have to look after it there. Our soil quality we have to do locally. But it's a good point, and we have a report also. Actually doing the overseas stuff is really difficult. The only thing we can do is biomass imports, but that deals with some of the problem. Yeah, so what I talked about here was a national level responsibility. Government has responsibility for the national assets. Now, clearly, exactly how you deliver plans and strategies to improve matters depends on going down to these finer scales and looking at particular reserves or particular bits of habitat or particular river systems and so on. So there'll be a kind of to and fro. And of course, in areas where there's lots of privately owned land, and there's land that's being managed for other kinds of profitable purposes, you've got to sort of balance up this top-down with the bottom-up thing. But if you don't do the top-down, if you don't do this high-level accounting, the bottom-up is going to give you the wrong answer. So all I'm saying is that having this strategic look from high level will help pull through all that bottom-up activity within subsets of management and so on to deliver a better outcome for everyone. So this is a very interesting question about environmental economists and ecological economists, which I didn't know until a couple of years ago, probably 3 years ago, that they were so different to one another. And I made the mistake of talking to the wrong one about the other one. And apparently there's a whole taxonomy there that economists know about. I'm sure you guys know about it. But no, I think the answer is no, that there isn't. They still operate pretty much as completely separate disciplines, and it's quite beyond me to comment any further on it, I'm afraid.
That's a shame.